All right. Hi, welcome. My name is Celine Coggins. I'm the Executive Director of Grant Makers for Education. For those of you who have joined us in the past, you should know that these first Friday afternoon sessions tend to be folks from philanthropy speaking, folks from research and from the field speaking about education issues. Today, we're just gonna have me. And so I hope this is a session that allows for lots of questions from members. This is based on a piece of research that we did. All research comes from somewhere, so I think that what I'll do is start by sharing a little bit about where this research came from. We'll talk for about 15 to 20 minutes about the findings and what they mean for philanthropy, and then we'll open things up to questions. As we go along, my trusty team of Hannah and Jesse are going to be helping to move the slides forward and so on and so forth. So we're here to talk about our new report, A View from the Classroom, What Teachers Can Tell Philanthropy About the Needs of Schools. So for those of you who don't know, I've been at Grant Makers for Education for about a year and a half. And prior to that, I ran a different kind of network. For the decade before that, I had founded and run a network of teachers. And so I'm very interested in the voice of teachers. I ran an organization called Teach Plus, so that's my daughters when they were a little bit younger, under the logo side. Very near and dear to my heart is the voice of teachers. I also know from our members that we hear a lot about, from funders, about this interest in wanting to hear more from the communities we seek to serve. So that can be students, that can be parents, that can be other members of communities, and certainly it can be teachers. And so as I was thinking about this research and thinking a little bit about the kind of world I know in the teacher community, I felt like it would be really interesting to bridge those two worlds. But the other catalyst for this work was our benchmarking report that came out just about a year ago. So it was Trends in Education Philanthropy, and we saw some really important trends in the way that funders were moving and the priorities that funders were enacting. And so what we were able to do with this piece of research was say, okay, so we see a lot of movement in the world of funding in education. How does that track with what teachers are saying schools need? All right, so let's move on to the next slide. So number one, I just want to say that I'm a former researcher as well, and when I heard that the Donors Choose database of over 1.8 million teacher requests was publicly available for analysis, my mouth watered. This is a huge database. For context, most of the times when we see survey-based research, it's based on 100 respondents or at max 1,000 respondents. So this is just a really massive database that can tell us a lot of things. It has existed for over 10 years. So we were able to look at data from 2008 all the way up through the end of 2019 when we were doing the research. And for perspective on how ubiquitous this is in the American landscape, over 80% of schools in America have made at least one request through Donors Choose. So I also want to say though, with all research, this just tells one piece of the story of American education. When I teach at Harvard, I start teaching about policy and systems change by talking about the blind men and the elephant story. I'm sure many of you know it. There are lots of men touching different parts of the elephant, one touching the tail and saying, it's like a rope, one touching the wall of the belly and saying, it's like a wall, one touching the trunk and saying, it's wet and moist. All of those things are true. So this is just one slice. If you ask teachers, budget for the whole system with all of the system dollars, they might say different things are most important. If you ask superintendents, they might say different things are important. But this research does tell us some really interesting things, especially when you compare it to where funders are at these days. So we asked 3 primary questions. They're right up there on the slide. What are the needs that teachers identify and how have they changed over time? How do requests and funding patterns differ in high and low poverty contexts? And then where's their alignment between trends in teacher requests and trends in funder requests? So I want to say a little bit more on this. A year ago, we released this report, Trends in Education Philanthropy. We had given it 5 times over the past 10 years. We saw a lot of consistency between 2008 and 2015, so roughly the Obama era. And then between 2015 and 2018, we saw 3 big shifts. Number 1 was a move away from the kind of academic core of K-12 schooling towards support of the whole child. So much less on teacher quality, on standards, on assessments, much more on social and emotional learning, on equity, on wraparound services. In a second trend, we saw a move generally away from K-12 toward especially post-secondary, but also a little bit in the early childhood domain. So a move away from that center 13 years of the child's school experience toward the tails. And then the third major trend we saw when we released this research last year was major distrust in government as thought leader setting the agenda, and major kind of skepticism about whether we were funding schools enough, both from the federal government and at the state level. All of these show up. There's a story to tell in this new research that we've done that kind of aligns to this in different ways around what teachers are telling us. So I want you to start as you're sitting in your seats and make a guess. So if we've seen this trend, a move away from academics toward the whole child, are we seeing something similar, or are we seeing something different in teacher requests? There's a really clear answer in our research. All right, so let's move on to the next slide. So this is a big one. This was a surprising one, frankly, the second half of the clause here. So the majority of requests come from high poverty schools, but requests from low poverty schools get funded at higher rates. This was a surprise to Donors Choose. This was a surprise to us as we were looking at it. Obviously, the platform was developed to support teachers in under-resourced areas in getting the resources they needed for schools. So let's break this down. Let's go to the next slide and talk about the first part of that clause. So we see hundreds of thousands of requests each year. The database is growing. The number of requests are growing at a really incredible rate, a rate of about 23% each year. So you see, first of all, huge growth in the use of this, huge growth in teachers as basically, fundraisers. Most of this growth is in high poverty schools. So most of the dollars that flow through the Donors Choose database are flowing to high poverty schools. So really important to note that this still is a tool that is mostly for high poverty schools. So, we just saw there was an article based on this research that came out in NEA Today in the National Education Association's periodical. And, they talked about, like, this is something that we really as a society need to draw our attention to. Do we want teachers fundraising? And let's really look at what they're asking for dollars for. Super important. All right, let's go on to the next slide. But this is something, so you see a real flip, and a really important flip in trends over time. So the way the database works is you can look at, number 1, what are teachers requesting? And then number 2, what projects get funded? So if you look back over time, from 2009 in the really early days of the platform, all the way up until 2017, if you were a teacher teaching in a high poverty school, you were more likely to get your request funded. Very recently, that trend has flipped. So now it's the case that this database, this is a real important question of scale for a nonprofit like Donors Choose. Now everyone knows about Donors Choose. It's become a household name. And school districts like the one my kids attend, that is a little bit more on the affluent side, know that if they're trying to go to one-to-one laptops, and this is what just happened in my school, they say, oh, we don't quite have all the money, let's just put a bunch up on Donors Choose, and the parents fill them. And so this has real implications for our lower poverty schools, and how, this question of how do we close that emerging gap is something that I hope we in the philanthropic community can be talking about, because that's a really important and different trend. All right, let's move on to the next one. Okay, So now finding two, I asked you before, which do you think? Is it academic materials or the wraparound services that teachers are requesting more? It's really conclusive in the data. Teacher requests for academic materials far exceed any other type of request regardless of context. So if we go to the next slide, you see this in really stark relief. So teachers are asking for supplies for their classrooms. They're asking for the materials to do their core academic work. And so the literacy and language is at the top of the list, math and science next, by leaps and bounds, ahead of music, art, special needs, health and sports, civics and history. We're going to talk about some of those other odd categories like applied learning later, but really important to just kind of note how dominant these requests are to do the basic work that they need. So, you know, this is requests for books, this is requests for manipulative so that you can teach math. Those are the things that are really dominant. So this shows an area of dissonance from where funders are at. Funders are saying we're moving kind of away from this, at least as far as our research tells us. Teachers are saying, you know, there is an unmet need here. So let's move on to the next slide. So then I thought I was being really clever. We could query the data in a lot of ways and align it to a lot of other pieces of information that are out there. So we know that, for example, some states spend only about an average of $5,000 per pupil annually, and others spend $30,000. So I thought maybe there's going to be difference in what teachers are asking for in those higher spending states and the lower spending states. Nope. It was still literacy and math right at the top, and the top 5 really were remarkably consistent. And then we thought, hey, we know that some states tend to perform higher on standardized tests than others. Maybe that shows a value in some ways of how they think about literacy and math. But if you look at the high performing states and the lowest performing states, we did the top 5 and the bottom 5, exact same request areas. Then we go on to the next one. Next slide. So, no, back. Sorry. We also know there are huge regional variations in the way people think about everything. I think we've seen that a lot this week in the primaries. So we asked the question, if you break it down by region, are there differences in what teachers request? Still, the categories are remarkably consistent with literacy and language at the top, then math, and so on and so forth. So we thought we were being creative. We thought there would be a story to tell there. The story there really is just the remarkable consistency, and that these are areas of need that we as funders should not be under-recognizing. All right, so then we asked the question though, where do we see fast-growing areas of need? So the fastest growing categories, if you don't look at absolute terms, but you look at growth, there we really see that the fastest growing categories are non-academic and focused on the needs of the whole learner. So we're able to get that at that in a lot of ways in the database. So let's go to the next slide. So number 1, look at warmth, hunger, and care. So this was a category, and Donors Choose is resistant to building new categories, but there was so much demand for basic things that students need. So for example, you know, coats. So if you're standing at the bus stop out in front, in Boston where I live in the middle of the winter, you're not inhibited from coming to school because you don't have a coat that you need to get there. Things that have to do with nutrition and food, toothbrushes. Those are the types of things that that led Donors Choose in 2016 to create a whole new category. And since they've created that category, it's just taken off. When we did a physical in-person release event in Indianapolis on this report, the teachers who were on the panel didn't even realize there was a warmth, hunger, and care category, and then all said, we're going to start putting requests on in this category because that's so important to us. So you see this year-over-year growth basically in the 3 years since this has been a possibility. The rates of requests have tripled, then tripled again, then tripled again. So it far exceeds the growth of any other categories, though you do see categories like health and wellness, character education. Those are the other ones that are really growing. So now if we go to the next slide, we know that a huge issue that is of interest to funders and of growing interest to funders is the topic of equity and social justice. So you can query based on how many requests have those keywords in them, and you see there's a really important kind of acceleration in those topic areas. And likewise, if you go to the next slide on social and emotional learning. So this is applied learning is kind of the catch-all category within Donors Choose. It has things like early development. It has college and career readiness. So it's a little bit of a catch-all. They decided to add into it social and emotional learning just in 2019. And just in, we were able to stop kind of our data collection in December. Almost 10% of all requests on the Donors Choose database in 2019 were for social and emotional learning. That had never been a category before, and now it's really quickly accelerating in terms of the number of projects that are in there. So this is an area on net, this whole child, that really is tracking. So you've got a trend in philanthropy moving in this direction, and you've got a real acceleration in teacher requests in these areas. So there's a great area of alignment, I think, where funders really are aligned to what teachers are saying schools need. All right, let's move on to the next slide. Certain categories of need are more likely to go unmet than others. I'm just gonna leave this slide up for a minute. So a couple of things here that I think are important. As the parent of a middle school kid, I'll tell you, pre-K is the most popular. Surprisingly, high school is second most popular in terms of a project getting funded. Middle school is the lost and forgotten area where projects are least likely to get funded. Another kind of interesting fact in terms of what's likely to get funded and not, despite funders' interest in college and career preparation and those transitions between high school and post-secondary, those are the projects that of all projects, the ones that have to do with college and career prep are the ones that are very least likely to get funded. You can see by you saw the warmth, hunger, and care requests are very much growing, but also those are the most likely to get filled of all on the site. You can see differences. Smaller projects are more likely to get funded than larger projects. And then an interesting point, if you go to the next slide, we know many of our funders are interested in rural areas. This Donors Choose was founded in Brooklyn. It was originally kind of a city type of tool. It is overutilized in cities. It's underutilized in rural areas. So there are a lot of kind of pieces of the puzzle in here. And then lastly, the needs of high poverty and low poverty schools differ. So, so if you go to the next slide, what we were able to do is calculate kind of based on the number of requests, what you would expect to see in each category in terms of the number of requests, and then where there was variation. Where you see variation and a greater likelihood of requests, in high poverty schools, it's really the need to have. So, so there's a greater than expected requests for warmth, hunger, and care, for ELL supports, for team sports. In low poverty schools, it's more in the kind of nice to have category, like supports to teach economics, supports to teach foreign language. So once again, you see those differences. So for me, I think this points to, and this is my kind of in conclusion, this really points to some system level challenges. I know within our network, this question of are schools adequately resourced and how do we pay attention to the question of resource equity is something that's you know, kind of frequently talked about in our network. I think this really tells a story about resource equity, resource inequity, I should say, and the need for system level change. It tells a story of things we can do as funders at the individual school level, you know, and with the Donors Choose database to help kind of ameliorate growing gaps. But it also tells a story of, you know, are schools in America funded at adequate rates when we know that, you know, that these are the types of things that we see teachers having to fundraise for. I'll conclude and say we did have an in-person event, and what we heard from teachers on the panel was, schools where every teacher is required to have at least one live donors choose request online at any time. We heard from teachers who had moved from lower poverty to lower income to higher income contexts and seen getting no projects funded when they were teaching the poorest kids to getting more projects funded as they moved. We heard from teachers who sometimes put up 3 projects in a day and spent their time in the teacher's lounge trying to figure out the tricks of the trade around donors choose. So this is, to me, a really, really important issue that tells us a lot about the system and resource inadequacy within the system. So now I'm going to kind of open it up to questions, comments, and I've been kind of just looking at my slides, so I'm going to open the chat box for the first time and hope to hear from all of you. I'm doing my best teacher wait time right now. There we go. Here, let's see. Oh, yes. So we did look at the breakdown by total dollars requested. So basically, you can look at projects. The way we did it was we looked at projects that were less than $300, between $300 and $900, and over $900. So it really kind of followed a simple normal curve. Like you saw, the projects that were $300 and less were far more likely to get funded. The projects that were in that middle ground were getting funded at kind of an average rate, and the ones that were expensive were not likely to get funded. So again, when we talk to teachers about this, they would say, yeah, I learned that instead of asking for, for all of the seats for my classroom, I would ask for them one at a time, because if you ask for them one at a time, they get funded. But if you ask for them all at once, they don't. And so again, in my mind, I'm kind of following parallel to this conversation. A lot of the kind of chatter online and the good research coming out about how much we know about the science of reading, and why aren't teachers, kind of spending all of their time in the teacher's lounge talking about and trading notes on the science of reading. Well, if you talk to teachers, what they say is what we do in the teacher's lounge is talk about whether it's a matching day where there's a major donor matching local donors on Donors Choose, because then you got to get on there 3 and 4 times. So this is a real reality of teachers in high poverty areas. All right, so I'm going to read the next question. The categories with the highest growth seem to be a smaller portion of the overall requests. Yes. So that's exactly what I was trying to underscore. You're exactly right. So we see huge requests for books. We see huge requests for math manipulatives. In absolute terms, that is really kind of where it's at in this database. That's where it's been for 10 years. There's been remarkable consistency over 10 years across geography, across all sorts of context questions. But what I heard from teachers as we queried more about this is, as teachers become aware that you can ask for things like coats, and there's a category that maybe a funder who's interested in those topics would actually go to and search for, then they say, okay, I heard from my colleague that my colleague got coats funded. Now I'm going to ask for that. And so there's a lot of kind of chatter among teachers. And from what I can tell, most don't think of it yet, and most don't even realize they can use the database and the kind of Donors Choose tool for those things. And so you would expect to see those continue to rise. When, if ever, it would eclipse math or literacy, I have no idea. But yes, it's a very small, right now, warmth, hunger, and care, while it's growing wildly, is still only 2% of requests. So really important to keep that in perspective. Let's see. Do you know how Donors Choose might just evolve its communication learning? Yeah, so I have had a ton of conversations with Charles Best, who is the founder of Donors Choose, en route to getting out this analysis. I think they are, number one, really excited about it, and I think very eager. If you all indicate to me you'd be interested in a conversation with Charles, he would do a conversation with you. I think obviously, funders are the most important part of their equation. I think that what he would say, so we were the first to kind of unearth that the projects from the lower poverty schools are the ones that are now more likely to get funded. And so he's kind of, said to me, how do we solve that problem? How do we work with, funders to solve that problem? Because I started this as a tool to support the needs that we know exist in low-income communities. And I don't want it as a tool for the rich to get richer. And so I think that's a really interesting, important challenge. And so to the extent that there are some of you on this call who want to have a conversation, I think that would be a great thing and a really useful outcome of this research. All right, next one. Is this a place where philanthropy could do more to help fulfill classroom needs, to support adequate education funding? Yeah, I mean, I think there are some really good examples where major donors come into the database and say, so in the case that I just, made as an example, maybe there's some sort of, kind of matching tracking grant that says we never want the projects of the more affluent to be better funded than the low affluent. And so we've got some sort of trigger in a funding pool to help ameliorate that. There are probably better ideas than that. That's the one that I could think of off the top of my head. I think just knowing as a funding community that you could search for those projects that sit in the whole child domain. We know that that's of interest to many of our funders. Knowing you can search for those, find those, and focus on those, I think is one other way of using the Donors Choose database. For my money, this tells a story of how do we get funders together with their powerful seats at the table to do advocacy around resource equity at the state level, at the federal level. Those are the system level things that I think come out of this research that are really important for funders to engage in as well. All right. Do you have anecdotal info from teachers or others about why middle school projects and college and career So not yet. I'd be interested if anyone on this call has ideas on that. I think, the middle school piece, like I said, I have middle schoolers. I taught middle school as well. Middle school is an awkward time and people sometimes stay away from it, and I have no good reason other than that. High school, people are excited to get their kids to college, and elementary and pre-K are super cute, and you might get a little note with a picture of the cute kids. So no, I don't. And then on the college and career, couple of things. So number one, I was surprised on that, given that we know this is an area of funder interest. It might be another place where funders don't know that this is something that you could use the Donors Choose platform to help support. So those are my best explanations. Those are kind of straight from me, not from any larger data source. How much is understood about why the lower poverty schools get funded at a higher rate? Yeah, I mean, so as I said, I was doing this research as I was sitting at my more affluent school site council, and and we didn't have enough money to finish going one-to-one on laptops, and so the principal said, let's put a request for eight teachers to put requests out on Donors Choose. They were filled the next day, and so in my mind, it's a scale question. Basically, it's a ubiquity of the site. Donors Choose has become a household name, and it seems like for schools that have dollars within their communities of parents, that it's just an easy way to get those dollars into the school. And so in my mind, so the social networks hypothesis, which you've raised, I think is part of it. I think we could do a further analysis. It's on the database around what the size of the gifts are. So usually in Donors Choose, it's a group of funders that ends up fulfilling the request. But probably true as well, that the more affluent the community, the more likely that, you know, requests up to a certain dollar amount just get fully funded by one individual. Let's see, next question. What do you make of the shift in philanthropic priorities away from basic academics, given what we see in this data? So, you know, it's to me, this is part of our job at GFE, is to say, we see these trends, and how do these trends check out? Are these the right trends? Are these, do these trends track with what we see on the ground in terms of need? And so when I started out, I said, I know that funders in our community are really interested in this question of, you know, how do we really listen authentically to people on the ground? Well, teachers are the ones on the ground in the trenches every day, and what they're saying is, I don't have enough books to teach well. I don't have the materials I need to teach math to kids. And so, so in my mind, this is an important thing to raise with funders, to just check where they are. And, you know, this is, I'm not imploring anyone to change, you know, their organization's strategy, but I do think this is a piece of information that helps to inform that strategy. And then, are the donors choose requests mostly coming from teachers or school leaders like principals, support staff? Really good, with more time, authority. Yes. So that's a very good question. And I think the answer to that is that there's no one model. So number one, we know lots of teachers just make requests on their own. Number two, we know that in some cases, like the one example I gave earlier, we had a teacher on the panel who said, my principal says we must have a request in, but does not say what the request should be. It might also be the case, although we did not have teachers on our particular panel, where, you know, a school gets together, and this might honestly have happened in my kids' middle school, and says, hey, we need this. Who's willing to put up for it on the Donors Choose website? And then I also know that, that one of the things that we know about the Donors Choose database is that, that in some districts, they're asking teachers not to use it. They don't think it's, you know, that superintendents should be the ones to raise, you know, who should be the ones to set the decisions on what projects get funded and what do not. And so, so there's a little bit of controversy there that sits at the edge of our research and frankly outside it, but is relevant to that question. Anything else? Let me just check. I'm in the, yeah, in the chat. Okay. Well, good. I'm going to wait one more minute or so to see if there are additional questions. Since we only had me as the speaker rather than 3 or 4 people, it's not a surprise to me that we went a little shorter. I will say that for those of you who were on today, would love to have a conversation, and you can certainly just email me at ccoggins@edfunders.org about, you know, is there something we do together on this topic, whether it's the larger topic of resource equity, whether it's the smaller topic of something we might do with Donors Choose. If you want to have a conversation with Charles, happy to set that up. And, you know, I think that that would be a really interesting and cool outcome.